June 17, 2017, 7:14 a.m. Cell Block C, Eastern State Penitentiary, Ohio. The air within Cell C-14 was thick and still, carrying the faint, persistent scent of Lysol and institutional decay. Officer Miller, conducting his routine morning check, paused outside the cell door. The usual sounds, a cough, the rustle of a blanket, the muted murmur from a neighboring cell, were absent. A profound silence emanated from within the four concrete walls. He peered through the small observation window. Sunlight filtered through the reinforced glass and wire mesh of the exterior window, cast weak. Slanted bars across the floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. On the lower bunk, beneath a thin, standard-issue gray blanket, pulled up to his chin, lay inmate David Thompson. Only the crown of his head and the contours of his cheekbone were visible. Officer Miller rapped sharply on the steel door, a percussive, echoing sound in the quiet corridor. No response. He repeated the action, louder this time. Still nothing. A prickle of unease, familiar yet unwelcome in this environment where routine was paramount, began to assert itself. He radioed his supervisor, his voice deliberately calm, devoid of alarm. Possible unresponsive inmate, Cell C-14, requesting immediate check. The supervisor, Sergeant Reyes, arrived within minutes, his expression impassive, his movements economical. The cell door was unbarred, a heavy, clanging sound as the mechanism disengaged. Reyes entered first, Officer Miller close behind. The interior of the cell was Spartan. 2 metal bunks, a small metal desk bolted to the floor, a toilet and sink combination unit. On the desk sat a worn paperback book, face down, its spine cracked. A single cup, presumably holding yesterday's water, sat beside it. The upper bunk was neatly made, their eyes immediately fixed on the lower bunk. Sergeant Reyes approached cautiously. He reached out a gloved hand and gently nudged the blanket. The inmate did not stir. A closer look revealed an unnatural stillness, a waxy pallor to the visible skin. Reyes carefully pulled the blanket down further. David Thompson's eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His skin was cold to the touch. Rigor mortis was already setting in, fixing his limbs in a rigid, unnatural position. There were no immediate, obvious signs of struggle or external trauma visible without disturbing the body further. However, a dark, dried stain was present on the pillow and the blanket near the inmate's head, subtle against the gray fabric, but distinct upon closer inspection. The air, previously just still, now felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. The silence that had initially drawn Officer Miller's attention now felt absolute, final. Sergeant Reyes backed away slowly, his gaze sweeping the small room, taking in every detail, cataloging the undisturbed nature of the space, the closed door, the single occupant. The standard operating procedure for an in-cell death was immediately initiated. The corridor outside Cell C-14, moments before routine, now became a focal point of activity. Guards secured the area, preventing other inmates from approaching. Medical personnel were summoned, their arrival a formality. Their examination confirmed the irreversible. David Thompson, inmate number 47832, was deceased. The official time of death would later be estimated, but the moment of discovery was logged precisely, 7:17 a.m. The cell, now a provisional crime scene, was sealed. An investigation, initially categorized as a standard in-custody death inquiry, commenced. This initial phase was characterized by methodical documentation. Photographs were taken from multiple angles. The position of the body was recorded. The contents of the cell were inventoried. Every detail, no matter how seemingly insignificant. The position of the book on the desk, the contents of a small plastic bag containing personal hygiene items, the state of the bunks, was meticulously documented. The scene, devoid of the typical chaos associated with violent death, presented an initial enigma. The lack of visible disturbance contradicted the underlying reality of a life unexpectedly ended within the confines of a supposedly secure environment. The grim process had begun, peeling back the layers of routine to reveal the hidden narrative concealed within the unyielding concrete and steel of Cell C-14. Eastern State Penitentiary was a sprawling, aging correctional facility. Its gray stone walls a formidable barrier against the outside world. Within its labyrinthine corridors resided hundreds of men serving sentences for a spectrum of offenses. Life inside was governed by strict schedules, unyielding rules, and an internal social hierarchy often invisible to those outside. David Thompson, 38 years old, had been incarcerated for 3 years, serving a sentence for armed robbery. He was generally perceived by staff as quiet, compliant, and unproblematic. He kept to himself, participated minimally in group activities, and had a limited disciplinary record. His cellmate was Kevin Jenkins, 42 years old, serving a lengthy sentence for aggravated assault. Jenkins was more outgoing, known for his ability to navigate the complex social landscape of the prison population. The two men had shared cell C-14 for just over a year, a standard cell assignment in the general population block. The dynamics of cellmate relationships in prison are complex, often born out of necessity and proximity. Inmates spend upwards of 20 hours a day confined together in spaces the size of a small bedroom. Shared existence required negotiation, tolerance, and unspoken agreement on space, noise, and privacy, limited as it was. While their official record provided basic biographical data and criminal histories, they offered little insight into the personal lives, relationships, or internal struggles of David Thompson and Kevin Jenkins. The narrative of their connection unfolded not in official files, but in the subtle observations of fellow inmates, the routines they established within the confines of their shared cell, and eventually through communications that would later surface. Their relationship, like many formed in such close quarters, began innocuously enough, a gradual progression from mere cohabitation to something more. It was a relationship conducted largely in silence, away from the prying eyes of staff and the judgment of other inmates. Within the micro-society of the prison, relationships between inmates, particularly those of a romantic or intimate nature, existed in a liminal space, often unspoken, sometimes tolerated, sometimes met with hostility. Thompson and Jenkins navigated the space with discretion. Their connection, though quiet, became a central, if hidden, aspect of their incarcerated lives. The details of how this relationship deepened were not documented in any official logbook, but were pieced together later through fragmented accounts and circumstantial evidence. It began with shared conversations during the limited recreation time, evolved during the long hours confined in the cell, and solidified into a bond that provided a measure of emotional connection in an environment designed to isolate. This bond, initially a source of solace, would ultimately become entangled with factors leading to tragedy. The initial investigation into Thompson's death proceeded methodically. The cell was meticulously processed by the prison's internal investigative unit, assisted by personnel from the State Police Crime Scene Unit. Every item was photographed and cataloged before being collected as potential evidence. Fingerprint analysis was conducted on all surfaces. Swabs were taken for DNA analysis. The dark stain on the blanket and pillow was carefully sampled. The body was removed from the cell with great care, transported to the county coroner's office for an autopsy. The autopsy was a critical step in determining the cause and manner of death. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the county coroner and a forensic pathologist, conducted the examination. The initial external examination noted the lack of visible defensive wounds or overt signs of violent struggle. However, internal examination revealed findings inconsistent with a natural death. Detailed analysis of the neck area revealed subtle signs of trauma consistent with manual strangulation. Hemorrhaging in the neck muscles and petechial hemorrhages in the eyes and eyelids indicated asphyxia. The hyoid bone, a small bone in the neck often fractured in strangulation cases, was intact, suggesting pressure applied using soft tissue, such as hands. Further examination determined that the time of death had likely occurred sometime during the night, perhaps hours before Officer Miller's discovery. The official cause of death was determined to be asphyxia due to manual strangulation. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. This finding immediately elevated the case from a standard death inquiry to a criminal investigation. The focus shifted definitively to foul play. The primary suspect, by virtue of proximity and opportunity, was immediately apparent. Kevin Jenkins, the sole occupant of Cell C, 14 with David Thompson on the night of his death. July 3rd, 2017, Eastern State Penitentiary, Administrative Segregation Unit. Following the autopsy results confirming homicide, Kevin Jenkins was immediately removed from the general population and placed in administrative segregation, a standard procedure when an inmate is suspected of a serious crime or poses a threat. His cell was searched rigorously, though it had already been processed as part of the crime scene. Prison officials initiated an internal investigation, while the State Police Homicide Unit took the lead on the criminal inquiry. Investigators needed to understand the context of Thompson's death, and that required delving into the lives and relationship of the two men. Witness interviews commenced. Other inmates in cell block C were interviewed, their statements taken with caution due to the inherent unreliability of prison informants and the complex power dynamics within the population. Guards who worked the night shift were questioned about any unusual sounds or activity originating from cell C-14. Inmate Jenkins himself was formally interrogated. Present were two state police detectives, Detective Sergeant Mark Riley and Detective Emily Carter, along with a prison investigator. Jenkins was advised of his rights. His demeanor during the interrogation was notably calm, almost attached. He initially denied any knowledge of Thompson's death, stating he had been asleep throughout the night and woke only when officers opened the cell door that morning. He described his relationship with Thompson as merely cellmates, amicable, but not particularly close. This characterization directly contradicted information that investigators were beginning to gather from other sources. Fellow inmates, speaking cautiously and often under duress, described a relationship that was closer than typical cellmates. Some hinted at an intimate connection, though specifics were scarce and often shrouded in rumor. One inmate, requesting anonymity, stated that Thompson and Jenkins were always together, spending their recreation time side by side, sharing food packages, and maintaining a quiet intensity in their interactions that set them apart from other cellmate pairings. Letters and recorded phone calls from Jenkins to individuals outside the prison were reviewed. While heavily censored and often coded, they provided glimpses into his emotional state and relationships outside the prison, but initially offered little direct evidence regarding Thompson. Investigators also began exploring potential motives. Prison homicides often stem from debts, disputes over territory or contraband, or personal conflicts. None of these seemed readily apparent in the relationship between Thompson and Jenkins, which witnesses described as largely harmonious, at least outwardly. The nature of their hidden, intimate relationship was a potential area of conflict, but investigators needed concrete evidence linking it to the murder. This is where a seemingly unrelated medical record became pivotal. During their background investigation into David Thompson, investigators requested his complete medical file from the Prison Health Services. This was a standard procedure for any in-custody death. Buried within the file, among records of routine checkups and minor ailments, was a recent diagnosis that would fundamentally alter the course of the investigation and provide a chilling potential motive. The record, dated just 3 weeks prior to his death, indicated that David Thompson had tested positive for human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. The diagnosis was recent, confirmed by follow-up testing. This medical information, while sensitive and private, was now a crucial piece of the investigative puzzle. Given the nature of the relationship that was beginning to be revealed between Thompson and Jenkins, the timing of this diagnosis was highly significant. It introduced the possibility that the discovery of the HIV infection could have precipitated a violent confrontation. Investigators immediately cross-referenced this finding with Kevin Jenkins's medical records. His file showed no history of HIV testing prior to the investigation. A test was ordered as part of the standard protocol following Thompson's death. The potential transmission of HIV between inmates, particularly within an intimate relationship, added a layer of complexity and potential volatility to the established timeline. The quiet, seemingly compliant inmate, David Thompson, was carrying a hidden medical secret, and his cellmate, Kevin Jenkins, the man now suspected of murder, was likely aware of it or perhaps had just discovered it. This revelation, occurring relatively early in the investigation, just weeks after the discovery of the body, shifted the focus dramatically. It moved the inquiry beyond a generic prison dispute and rooted it in a deeply personal, potentially explosive conflict arising from a concealed relationship and a life-altering medical diagnosis. The understated nature of the crime scene, the lack of overt violence initially perceived, stood in stark contrast with potential emotional devastation and fear that the discovery of HIV could unleash, particularly in a confined environment like prison where health fears were often magnified. The investigators now had a compelling theory: a relationship, its existence a secret within the prison walls, complicated by a serious health crisis, had culminated in fatal violence. The meticulous collection of physical evidence from cell C-14 and the detailed findings from the autopsy would need to be interpreted through the lens of this newly discovered context. The silent cell now seemed to echo with the unspoken turmoil that must have transpired within it. July 15, 2017, Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation Forensic Laboratory. The biological evidence collected from cell C-14 arrived at the State Forensic Laboratory for analysis. Forensic scientists commenced their painstaking work, seeking tangible proof of the events that transpired. The dark stain on the blanket and pillow was confirmed to be blood. DNA analysis was performed to identify its source. Testing confirmed the blood belonged to David Thompson. This was expected, given the circumstances of his death, but confirming it was a necessary step. More crucial was a search for trace evidence that might link Kevin Jenkins directly to the act of strangulation or provide further details about the struggle, however subtle it may have been. Swabs taken from around Thompson's neck and fingernails were analyzed for foreign DNA. Similarly, swabs were taken from Jenkins's hands and beneath his fingernails. The results of this analysis provided a significant breakthrough. Trace amounts of DNA consistent with Kevin Jenkins were found on the blanket in close proximity to the bloodstain and on the pillow where Thompson's head had rested. Crucially, microscopic fibers consistent with the material of Jenkins's standard-issue prison uniform shirt were recovered from Thompson's clothing and the blanket. While not definitive proof of strangulation, this evidence placed Jenkins in direct physical contact with Thompson in a manner inconsistent with typical cellmate interactions shortly before his death. The forensic pathologist report detailing the findings of manual strangulation, the internal hemorrhaging, the pressure applied to the neck, now paired with the DNA and fiber evidence, build a compelling circumstantial case. There were no signs of forced entry into the cell. The door was secured from the inside. The only two occupants were Thompson and Jenkins. The evidence pointed towards Jenkins as the perpetrator. Alongside the physical evidence, the investigation into relationship and the HIV diagnosis continued. Kevin Jenkins's mandatory HIV test results returned. They indicated that Kevin Jenkins was also HIV positive. Further testing was conducted to determine the strain of the virus present in both Thompson and Jenkins. While determining the precise timeline and direction of transmission is medically complex, forensic epidemiology can sometimes provide insights. In this case, the strains were found to be genetically very similar, suggesting a potential common source or transmission event between the two individuals. The timing of Thompson's recent diagnosis became increasingly relevant. Had Thompson discovered his HIV status and informed Jenkins, potentially leading to a confrontation? Or had Jenkins discovered his own status, perhaps suspecting Thompson was the source, triggering a violent reaction? The timeline was critical. Thompson's diagnosis was confirmed just 3 weeks before his death. Jenkins's positive status was discovered after the murder. This suggested Thompson's diagnosis likely preceded Jenkins's knowledge of his own status, at least officially. The investigation now focused on establishing whether Thompson had informed Jenkins of his diagnosis. There were no direct communications found in the initial review of letters or calls where this was explicitly stated. However, investigators discovered that shortly after his diagnosis, David Thompson had attempted to access counseling services related to HIV within the prison. While details of these sessions were confidential medical information, the fact that he was seeking support indicated he was grappling with the diagnosis. Furthermore, interviews with other inmates who had some limited interaction with Thompson in the days leading up to his death suggested he had seemed withdrawn, visibly distressed, though he had not confided the reason to anyone. This provided circumstantial evidence that Thompson was experiencing significant emotional turmoil related to his health, a turmoil that could have potentially been shared with his closest confidant within the prison, Kevin Jenkins. The narrative solidifying was one of a hidden relationship, a devastating medical diagnosis, and a violent outcome. The forensic evidence from the cell, combined with the medical findings and the emerging details of the relationship, provided a powerful, albeit grim, picture of the events culminating in David Thompson's death. The understated brutality of manual strangulation, requiring close physical contact and a sustained application of force, underscore the intensely personal nature of the crime. It was not a random act of violence, but one born out of proximity, intimacy, and a breaking point reached within the confines of their shared, secret world. August 1st, 2017, Prosecutor's Office, Fairview County, Ohio. Armed with the forensic findings, the autopsy report, the witness statements, and the medical records of both inmates, the state police detectives presented their case to the Fairview County Prosecutor's Office. The evidence, though circumstantial in the absence of a direct confession or eyewitness account of the murder itself, was compelling. The victim, David Thompson, was found dead in his locked cell. The cause of death, manual strangulation. The only other occupant was Kevin Jenkins. Forensic evidence linked Jenkins physically to Thompson at the time of death. The context of their relationship, coupled with the recent discovery of HIV infection in both men, with Thompson's diagnosis preceding Jenkins' knowledge of his own status, provided a powerful potential motive centered on fear, anger, or betrayal related to the disease transmission within their intimate relationship. Prosecutor Alan Stone reviewed the case file meticulously. He recognized the challenges of prosecuting a murder case within a prison environment, where witness credibility is often questionable and physical evidence can be complex to interpret. However, the combination of the detailed forensic report, the medical evidence, and the established timeline created a strong narrative framework. He authorized filing charges against Kevin Jenkins for the murder of David Thompson. A grand jury was convened, reviewing the evidence presented by the prosecution. They found sufficient cause to indict Kevin Jenkins on one count of murder in the second degree. The lesser charge, as opposed to first-degree murder, reflected the lack of direct evidence proving premeditation. The prosecution theorized the killing likely occurred in the heat of passion, triggered by a confrontation or discovery related to the HIV status. News of the indictment, though confined largely within the correctional system and local legal circles, sent ripples through Eastern State Penitentiary. Another layer of tension settled over Cell Block C, the scene of the crime. Kevin Jenkins was formally arraigned. He entered a plea of not guilty. The legal process commenced, moving the case from the investigative phase into the formal arena of the justice system. Pre-trial motions were filed, evidence discovery proceeded, and both the prosecution and the defense began preparing their cases. The prosecution strategy hinged on presenting a cohesive narrative. The secret gay relationship between the two inmates, the devastating discovery of HIV, the ensuing conflict, and the fatal outcome within the locked cell. They would rely heavily on the forensic evidence, the medical records, and the testimony of the medical examiner and forensic scientists. Witness testimony from other inmates or prison staff would be used cautiously, primarily to establish the existence of the relationship and the general environment, rather than provide a blow-by-blow account of the night of the murder. The defense's strategy was anticipated to focus on a lack of direct evidence. No one saw the murder. Jenkins maintained his innocence, claiming he slept through the entire event. The defense could argue that the forensic evidence, while placing Jenkins in the cell, did not definitively prove he committed the strangulation. They might attempt to raise questions about other possibilities, however improbable within the locked cell environment, or challenge the interpretation of the medical and forensic findings. The defense would likely portray the relationship as a casual cellmate arrangement, downplaying or denying any intimate connection, and question the relevance and accuracy of the HIV transmission context as a motive. The case was scheduled for trial. The slow, meticulous work of the investigation had reached a critical juncture, moving from a quiet documentation of a death scene to the adversarial process of the courtroom. The hidden life shared by David Thompson and Kevin Jenkins, concealed within the prison's walls, was about to be exposed to public scrutiny, its tragic end dissected in search of justice. The formal indictment marked a significant step. translating the grim reality discovered in Cell C-14 into legal terms and setting the stage for the attempt to hold someone accountable for the death of David Thompson. February 12, 2018, Fairview County Court of Common Pleas. The trial of Kevin Jenkins for the murder of David Thompson commenced. The courtroom, though a formal setting, held a subdued atmosphere, a reflection of the grim nature of the charges and the setting where the crime occurred. Prosecutor Alan Stone delivered his opening statement, outlining the state's case. He described the discovery of David Thompson's body in Cell C-14, the findings of the autopsy confirming manual strangulation, and the forensic evidence linking Kevin Jenkins to the scene. He then addressed the motive directly, albeit with professional restraint. He spoke of a relationship of a personal nature between the two men and the devastating discovery of a serious medical condition that the state contended led to a fatal confrontation. The defense attorney, a public defender named Sarah Chun, presented her opening statement, emphasizing a lack of direct evidence. She painted a picture of two men who were simply cellmates, nothing more, and argued that the state could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Kevin Jenkins had caused David Thompson's death. She highlighted the absence of any eyewitnesses to the alleged crime and suggested that the forensic evidence was inconclusive. The prosecution began presenting its case. Prison officials testified about finding the body and securing the scene. Forensic scientists detailed their findings: the presence of David Thompson's blood, the trace DNA of Kevin Jenkins on the blanket and pillow, the fibers from Jenkins's uniform found on Thompson. The medical examiner, Dr. Evelyn Reed, provided compelling testimony about the autopsy findings, explaining how the injuries to Thompson's neck were consistent with manual strangulation and inconsistent with natural death or accident. Her clinical description of mechanics of asphyxia painted a vivid, albeit unsettling, picture for the jury. The prosecution then introduced the medical records, presenting evidence of David Thompson's recent HIV diagnosis just weeks before his death. They called a prison medical staff member to establish the timeline of Thompson's diagnosis and his attempt to access counseling. While legally complex due to privacy concerns, the court allowed the introduction of this information based on its relevance to motive. The state argued that Thompson's diagnosis and his potential transmission to Jenkins within the context of their intimate relationship provided the critical missing piece: the reason why Jenkins would kill his cellmate. Kevin Jenkins' own HIV-positive status, discovered after the murder, was also presented not necessarily as proof of transmission from Thompson, but as evidence of his status at the time of the investigation, reinforcing the context of the disease's presence in their shared lives and bodies. The prosecution's presentation was methodical, building layer upon layer of circumstantial evidence. They used charts and diagrams to illustrate the cell layout and the location of evidence. They played brief excerpts from recorded phone calls Jenkins made to family members in the days before Thompson's death, seeking to establish his general state of mind, though these were carefully selected and often did not directly reference Thompson or their relationship. They did not call any inmates to testify about the intimate nature of the relationship, recognizing the inherent risks and focusing instead on the more reliable forensic and medical evidence. February 15th, 2018, Fairview County Court of Common Pleas. The defense began presenting its case. Sarah Chin called several prison guards who testified to Kevin Jenkins' generally calm demeanor and lack of disciplinary issues prior to the incident. They characterized Jenkins as a model inmate for the most part. The defense also called a forensic consultant who offered alternative interpretations of the trace evidence, suggesting the DNA and fibers could have been transferred through routine contact within the confines of a shared cell over a long period, rather than during a struggle. The consultant argued that the absence of more significant signs of struggle or defensive wounds on Thompson or injuries on Jenkins weakened the state's strangulation theory. The defense sought to cast doubt on the state's proposed motive. They argued that while Thompson may have been diagnosed with HIV, there was no direct evidence that he had informed Jenkins of this fact or that this had caused any conflict. They challenged the notion of an intimate relationship, suggesting that any closeness observed was simply typical behavior for long-term cellmates. They called a former cellmate of Jenkins, from before he was housed with Thompson, who testified that Jenkins had never discussed having intimate relationships with men. This testimony, while not definitive, aimed to counter the prosecution's narrative of a secret relationship. Kevin Jenkins chose to testify in his own defense. This was a risky decision, but one he and his attorney clearly felt was necessary to directly address the charges and the state's narrative. Jenkins maintained his calm, detached demeanor on the stand. He reiterated his claim that he was asleep during the night and awoke only when officers entered the cell. He denied any knowledge of how David Thompson died. When asked about his relationship with Thompson, he described it as purely platonic, a cellmate relationship based on mutual respect and keeping to themselves. He denied any physical or romantic involvement. When questioned about his HIV diagnosis, he stated he was unaware of his status until after the investigation began, thereby attempting to decouple his status and Thompson's from being a potential motive for murder. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Stone pressed Jenkins on the inconsistencies between his tests. He questioned him about the trace DNA and fibers found on Thompson, asking how they could have gotten there if he was asleep and there was no struggle. Jenkins offered vague responses, attributing it to the close quarters and long shared history in the cell. Stone also challenged Jenkins' denial of an intimate relationship, subtly referencing the statements from other inmates, though not introducing the inmate testimony itself as per strategy. Jenkins remained steadfast in his denial, his composure rarely breaking. The defense rested its case. The prosecution offered brief rebuttal testimony. The trial moved to closing arguments. Prosecutor Stone summarized the state's case, emphasizing the confluence of evidence. The victim found dead of strangulation in a locked cell, the defendant being the only other occupant, the forensic evidence placing the defendant in physical contact, and the powerful potential motive provided by the secret relationship and the shared HIV status. He argued that while circumstantial, the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to Kevin Jenkins as the person who strangled David Thompson. Sarah Chun, in her closing argument, focused on the burden of proof. She reminded the jury that the state must prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. She reiterated the lack of direct evidence, arguing that the forensic findings were ambiguous and that the state's theory of motive was based on speculation about the relationship and the timing of the HIV diagnoses. She urged the jury to find her client not guilty, emphasizing his consistent denial of guilt and the absence of definitive proof. The jury was instructed by the judge and retired to deliberate. The fate of Kevin Jenkins and the legal interpretation of the tragic events in Cell C-14 now rested in their hands. February 20th, 2018, Fairview County Court of Common Pleas. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood to read the decision. On the charge of murder in the second degree, the jury found Kevin Jenkins guilty. The verdict was met with a quiet solemnity in the courtroom. Kevin Jenkins, his face impassive, showed little outward reaction. His attorney placed a hand on his arm. Prosecutor Stone maintained a stoic demeanor. The jury had clearly accepted the state's circumstantial case, finding the combination of the forensic evidence, the medical context, and the logical inference of motive arising from the secret relationship and the HIV diagnosis to be sufficient to meet the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The court moved toward sentencing. Murder in the second degree in Ohio carries a potential sentence of 15 years to life in prison. Given that Jenkins was already serving a lengthy sentence, the new sentence would likely be served consecutively, effectively ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. Prior to sentencing, victim impact statements were permitted. David Thompson's family, who had attended the trial quietly, chose to submit a written statement read aloud by a victim advocate. It spoke of their grief, the unanswered questions, and the profound loss of their son and brother, emphasizing the quiet dignity with which he had faced his incarceration and the additional pain inflicted by the circumstances of his death. They did not speak of his relationship with Jenkins or the HIV diagnosis, focusing instead on the human being taken from them. Kevin Jenkins was given the opportunity to speak, but declined. The judge, in delivering the sentence, addressed the defendant directly, citing the gravity of the crime and the devastating impact on the victim and his family. He referenced the jury's finding that Jenkins had intentionally caused Thompson's death. The judge sentenced Kevin Jenkins to a term of 15 years to life, to be served consecutively to his existing sentence. The legal proceedings concluded. Kevin Jenkins was returned to Eastern State Penitentiary, now a convicted murderer, his sentence effectively rendering him permanently confined. The case file will be closed, the evidence archived, the bare facts entered into the official record. Inmate David Thompson, cause of death, homicide, strangulation. Perpetrator, inmate Kevin Jenkins. The story of Cell C-14, while legally concluded, leaves a somber, haunting legacy. Within the unyielding architecture of the prison system, a hidden human drama unfolded, culminating in tragedy. A relationship, born out of the desperate need for connection in an isolating environment, became entangled with a life-altering medical diagnosis. The specific dynamics of power, fear, and emotion within that secret bond remain ultimately known only to the two men involved, one now deceased, the other condemned. The official narrative, built on forensic evidence, medical facts, and legal interpretation, provides a how and the who, and a plausible why rooted in the devastating context of disease transmission within a confined, intimate relationship. Yet, the full emotional weight of the moments leading to David Thompson's death, the confrontation over the diagnosis, the fear or anger that erupted into violence, remain locked within the silence of that cell. The human cost extends beyond the victim. Kevin Jenkins, whether driven by panic, rage, or some other complex impulse, committed an act that erased a life and solidified his own fate within the correctional system. Families on both sides are left to grapple with the devastating consequences of events they could not control and perhaps did not fully understand. The incident serves as a stark reminder of the complex realities of life within prisons, where vulnerability, health crises, and personal relationships intersect in volatile ways, sometimes with fatal outcomes. The quiet discovery in Cell C-14 on that June morning revealed not just a death, but the final, tragic act in a hidden narrative of intimacy, illness, and violence, a story forever etched into the records, a grim testament to the human capacity for both connection and destruction, even in the most confined and controlled environments. The silence that initially alerted Officer Miller to the scene lingers, a poignant reminder of the lives irrevocably altered by the events that transpired unseen behind the steel door of Cell C-14.